In September 1983, under the cover of darkness, a fleet of semi-trucks rolled into the small desert town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. They pulled up to a local landfill, dumped their cargo, and watched as bulldozers immediately began pouring tons of concrete and dirt over the top, crushing the materials under the weight of the heavy treads. This hole in the ground was receiving millions of units of brand-new, factory-sealed inventory. Atari was intentionally destroying its own flagship products, burying the hardware that had made them the most successful tech company on the planet. Just 1 year prior, Atari controlled nearly 80% of the home video game market, pulling in $2 billion in annual revenue. They had essentially invented the industry from scratch. Yet here they were in the desert, burying millions of their own flagship game cartridges. A crash of this magnitude doesn't happen just because a market naturally cools off. Atari actively sabotaged its own empire. They traded engineering excellence for arrogant corporate mandates, pushed developers to the breaking point, and blinded themselves to the reality of their own products until the entire industry collapsed around them. To understand how they fell so far, you have to look at what made them successful in the first place. Back in 1971, computer engineer Nolan Bushnell saw a massive problem with early electronic entertainment. Games like Space War existed, but they ran on $120,000 mainframe computers housed deep inside university labs. The hardware was massive, expensive, and completely inaccessible to the general public. Bushnell wanted to bring that technology to the masses. In 1972, he founded Atari in Sunnyvale, California, alongside Ted Dabney. They focused entirely on physical engineering, building cheap, dedicated circuits that could handle specific tasks without needing a massive central computer. Their first major breakthrough was a simple two-dimensional tennis simulation called Pong. They installed the very first physical Pong cabinet in Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale. Within a few days, the machine literally broke because the coin mechanism was jammed with too many quarters. Pong took interactive entertainment out of sterile research facilities and put it directly into loud, smoky bars and bowling alleys. People who had never touched a computer keyboard were suddenly lining up to play a digital game. Those early days set the DNA of the company. Atari was a chaotic, brilliant collective of engineers solving complex physical problems. They focused heavily on making their products highly engaging and accessible to the public, and for a brief window, that pure engineering focus yielded staggering financial rewards. By 1977, Atari decided to move out of the arcade and directly into the living room. They launched the Atari 2600, a home console featuring a heavy wood grain aesthetic and interchangeable ROM cartridges. Consumers no longer had to buy a new machine to play a new game. Atari's annual revenue skyrocketed following the 2600. They went from $75 million in 1977 to over $2 billion by 1982, crushing early competitors. Atari owned the ecosystem. 30 million consoles worldwide made them the sole gatekeeper of the multi-billion-dollar home gaming market. Internally, the company operated like a rock band. Atari's early Silicon Valley campus featured hot tubs, open bars, and a famously casual environment where brilliant programmers worked bizarre hours. They were the undisputed kings of the tech world, and they lived like it. But immense cash flow attracted corporate attention. Warner Communications bought Atari for $28 million, eventually installing new CEO Ray Kassar. Kassar came from the textile industry. He viewed the programmers not as creative engineers, but as assembly line factory workers. He instituted strict dress codes, locked down hours, and prioritized executive control over creative freedom. At the precise moment their profits reached their absolute maximum height, the company's internal foundation violently fractured beneath them. The executives at the top began making decisions based entirely on quarterly earnings goals, openly ignoring the technical realities of the hardware and the people building it. Kassar's new mandate was simple: volume and speed. Warner expected massive quarterly growth, demanding Atari pump out big-name titles for the holiday seasons, regardless of how long they actually took to build. Kassar also explicitly refused to give developers public credit on the game boxes or pay them royalties, insisting that anyone could do their job. The engineers, fully aware that their code was generating billions for Warner, rebelled. Top developers like David Crane, Alan Miller, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan walked out the door and founded Activision, becoming the very first third-party game developer. They stripped Atari of its best talent exactly when the company needed it most. The corporate pressure to hit deadlines over quality culminated in 1982. Atari secured the rights to port the massive arcade hit Pac-Man to 2600. But to get it on shelves for the lucrative holiday season, management gave programmer Todd Fry an impossible timeline. He had roughly 5 weeks to compress an incredibly complex arcade cabinet into a tiny home cartridge. The result was disastrous. The home version of Pac-Man suffered from aggressive flickering and horrific sound design. Shortly after, they rushed out the door an adaptation of the movie E.T., giving programmer Howard Scott Warshaw another absurd 5-week deadline. The market was suddenly flooded with millions of copies of heavily marketed, completely unplayable software. This cascading bar chart shows the North American video game industry's market value. Furious at spending premium money on broken garbage, consumers stopped buying completely. Retailers desperately slashed prices. From $3.2 billion in 1982, the industry plunged to just $100 million by 1985. Atari executives assumed their brand name alone guaranteed sales, failing to realize that a monopoly only holds as long as the consumer trusts the product. When they broke that trust to hit a holiday deadline, they burned their own market to the ground. The financial bleeding was so severe that Warner Communications quickly carved up the company and sold it for parts in 1984. The physical manifestation of their failure, millions of unsold, highly anticipated cartridges, ended up unceremoniously dumped in that Alamogordo landfill, rotting in the desert dirt. Decades later, the technology industry still wrestles with this exact dynamic. The pressure from investors to ship half-finished products, meet aggressive quarterly timelines, and ignore internal engineering concerns happens in modern server farms the exact same way it happened in 1970s boardrooms. No market lead is permanent. Atari proved that you can invent an entire industry and dominate the world. But the moment you prioritize the earnings calendar over the actual quality of what you build, you are simply digging your own grave.